Saturday mornings on a farm are usually calm, the kind of calm you can hear. A rooster crowing in the distance, the faint hum of a tractor, the rhythm of boots crunching over gravel. But that morning wasn't calm at all. Instead, I woke up to the sound of furious honking, like someone was trying to summon the dead with a car horn. By the time I threw on a flannel and stepped outside, I saw a shiny Lexus SUV parked half across my gravel drive, horn blaring, and a woman standing by the hood with her arms folded like she was preparing for a photo shoot of her outrage. I didn't need to guess who it was. It was Karen from the HOA, the self-declared gatekeeper of the neighborhood, except my farm wasn't even part of her HOA. That detail never seemed to bother her. She operated under the belief that all land within a mile radius was under her divine jurisdiction. I didn't say anything at first. I just leaned against my fence post and let her rant start without me. She was shouting about how my cows were ruining the view from her cul-de-sac, how my tractor shouldn't be allowed to idle past 7 a.m., and, my personal favorite, how my barn looked too rustic. Rustic on a farm. It was like yelling at the ocean for being too wet. I sipped my coffee in silence, and that only seemed to make her madder. Finally, she crossed her arms tighter and said she'd be back with paperwork, which was Karen speak for a folder of printouts she found on Google about trespassing and noise ordinances that didn't actually apply here. Then she drove off in a storm of gravel and indignation, leaving behind the faint smell of burned Lexus tires. The first time she trespassed, it was almost funny. I caught her walking through my fields in wedge sandals, snapping photos of my fence line like she was preparing for a zoning board hearing. I asked her calmly if she knew she was on private property. She puffed up and said she had a right to inspect, because property values were at stake. I pointed to the very clear "No trespassing" signs nailed every 50 feet on my fence. She smirked and said those didn't apply to her because she was on official HOA business. I let her finish her little photo shoot and walk off, because frankly, the sight of her heels sinking into mud patches was entertainment enough. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. Karen never stopped at one attempt. She was like a bad sequel franchise. If she had one entry, she was guaranteed to make 6 more. The second time was worse. She brought backup in the form of 2 other board members from her HOA, clipboard in hand, as if they were conducting an inspection. They walked right into my field again, poking at my fence posts and shaking their heads dramatically. One of them even jotted something down like they were writing citations. I stood there with my arms folded, watching 3 people in pressed khakis pretend they were land surveyors. Finally, I said, "You know, in most parts of the world, when you step onto someone's property without permission, it's called trespassing. Here, it's also called trespassing. Consistency is nice, isn't it?" Karen rolled her eyes and told me to calm down, because they were only trying to help raise standards. I told her the sheriff's office might have a different definition of help. That's when the phone calls started. I began getting warnings from a sheriff's deputy I knew personally. Apparently, Karen had called the non-emergency line to complain about illegal farm equipment storage, hazardous livestock practices, and unsightly fencing. The deputy laughed as he told me about it, because none of those things were crimes, let alone enforceable. He said, "Look, I'll file the report so she thinks it's on record, but unless you're housing radioactive goats, you're fine." I thanked him, but I also knew something bigger was coming. Karen was building a case in her head, and when her imagination ran out of steam, she usually compensated by marching directly onto my land. The breaking point came a week later. I came home one evening to find Karen, her Lexus parked half on my pasture grass, stomping around near my barn with a measuring tape. She was muttering about setbacks and easements, measuring from the barn wall to the fence line. My cows had gathered in a loose semicircle to watch, chewing their cud like this was prime entertainment. I asked her what exactly she thought she was doing. She snapped that my barn was encroaching and that she'd already spoken with the city. I asked which city official told her that, since we were in unincorporated county land miles outside city limit. She ignored the question and kept scribbling numbers. That's when I called the sheriff's office. Not the non-emergency line this time, but the direct line to the deputy who already knew the backstory. When the deputy pulled up 10 minutes later, the look on Karen's face was priceless. She immediately switched gears from righteous fury to fragile victimhood, telling the deputy she was just concerned about safety. The deputy asked if she had permission to be on my land. She hesitated, then said she didn't need it because she was on official HOA duty. The deputy didn't even bother hiding his grin. He calmly explained that trespassing laws didn't make exemptions for official HOA business, and that her repeated entries onto my farm without permission were grounds for a hefty fine. Karen gasped like she'd been slapped. She stammered something about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, but the deputy just pulled out his pad and began writing her up. When he said the number out loud, $10,000, you could hear the cows shift as if even they understood the drama. Karen shrieked that it was unfair, that she was being persecuted, that I had manipulated the system against her. The deputy told her flatly that she was lucky I hadn't pressed charges for harassment. She sputtered and waved her arms, but the fine was official. By the time she stomped back to her Lexus and tore out of my drive, her face was blotchy red, and I swear I could see papers flapping from her clipboard like surrender flags. I stood there in the evening light, watching dust rise behind her SUV, and for the first time since this nonsense started, I felt the quiet of my farm again. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Karen didn't know how to lose gracefully. But it was the first time the law had sided with me so publicly, and it felt like a shot fired across the bow. The real war with Karen had only just begun. The fine had been issued, the ink still drying on the deputy's pad when Karen sped off in her Lexus, but I knew better than to think it would stop her. A woman like that doesn't back down just because the law tells her she's wrong. If anything, it makes her double down. By the time I got back inside my farmhouse that evening, I was already imagining how she would spin the whole situation in her head. In Karen's world, she was never the problem. She was the heroine, the one noble citizen trying to protect property values, and I was the villain with my barns, cows, and fences. She wasn't going to lick her wounds quietly. No, she was going to come back swinging, and sure enough, she didn't waste much time proving me right. The next morning, I had coffee with Sheriff Tom, the same deputy who'd handed down her trespassing fine, at the diner in town. We'd been neighbors since high school, and he'd taken no small pleasure in writing Karen up. He slid into the booth across from me, still in uniform, and chuckled as he set his hat on the seat. She called the station 3 times last night, he said. First, she wanted to file a harassment complaint against you. Then she claimed I was biased. And the last call was about how the entire sheriff's department should be investigated for corruption. He stirred his coffee like it was just another day. I told her she was welcome to put it in writing. She hung up. I laughed because what else could you do? But beneath the humor there was an edge of unease. People like Karen didn't let things drop, and they didn't get smaller when cornered. They got louder. I asked Tom how enforceable the fine was, and he shrugged. She can fight it in court if she wants, but she'd have to pay bond first, and I doubt her HOA budget covers that. She'll try to wriggle out of it, but the county takes trespassing seriously. If she doesn't pay, liens start stacking. That was reassuring, but by the time I pulled back into my farm drive later that day, Karen had already escalated in a new direction. Her SUV was nowhere in sight, but there were fresh tire marks pressed into the grass near my north field. And on my gatepost, someone had stapled a sheet of paper wrapped in a plastic sleeve, like a homemade legal notice. I tore it off and read it. Notice of community violations. The letterhead was fake, some generic clip art of a gavel. The text claimed my farm was in violation of community standards, and ordered me to cease operations of hazardous agricultural activity immediately. Signed, HOA Enforcement Chairwoman Karen Miller. I laughed so hard I had to sit down on the fence rail. It was pure Karen, equal parts theater and delusion, but it also annoyed me that she thought her printout had authority. I pulled out my phone, took a photo for evidence, and sent it straight to Tom with the caption, "Is this legally binding enough to wipe out my mortgage?" He texted back, "Frame it. Might be worth something on eBay." Still, I didn't want her antics to go unanswered. So instead of ripping the notice down and tossing it, I laminated it properly and nailed it to my barn door like a badge of honor. That way, every time Karen or her cronies drove past, they'd see their own nonsense staring back at them, immortalized in plastic. Petty? Absolutely. But farming has taught me patience and strategy. Sometimes you win not by pushing harder, but by letting the other side stew in their own noise until they lose steam. Except Karen didn't lose steam. A few days later, she brought an audience. I was out near the south pasture fixing a trough when I saw 3 SUVs pull up along the gravel road. Out stepped Karen, 2 other HOA board members, and, bizarrely, a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. They walked up my drive like they were serving a subpoena. Karen waved dramatically at my fields and barns, then turned to the man in the suit, gesturing like she was presenting a case before a jury. I walked over slowly, wiping my hands on a rag, and asked the obvious, "Can I help you folks?" Karen answered like I wasn't even there. "This is the property I was telling you about." Clearly out of compliance. Completely unchecked. The man in the suit nodded gravely and scribbled something on a pad. I asked him who he was, and he introduced himself as a compliance consultant. Apparently, Karen had hired him to document violations so she could strengthen her appeal. I almost choked. A compliance consultant for my farm. I told him calmly that he was standing on private property without permission. He glanced at Karen, then back at me, and said he was authorized. I pointed to the "No Trespassing" sign again. Authorized by who? Because last time I checked, the HOA doesn't own this land. The man hesitated, clearly realizing he'd stepped into something he didn't understand. Karen rushed to fill the silence. "Don't play dumb. Everyone knows your activities are a nuisance. The board is prepared to escalate." I smiled in the way that only makes someone like her angrier. "Perfect," I said. "Escalate. Bring whoever you want. But bring a warrant too, because the next time you step past that fence, you'll be facing more than a fine." The consultant looked uneasy, muttered something about checking his calendar, and practically jogged back to his car. The other 2 board members followed. But Karen lingered, her face twisted in a cocktail of rage and disbelief, before finally storming off. That night, I installed 2 new trail cameras along the fence line. Not because I was afraid of what she'd do, I was confident the law had my back, but because I wanted receipt. With Karen, evidence was ammunition. If she so much as stepped a toe over the line again, I wanted it on film. And sure enough, within 48 hours, the cameras paid off. Around midnight, one of my cows started bawling loud enough to wake me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out, only to find Karen herself crouched by the fence with a pair of wire cutters, mid-snip. She froze like a raccoon caught in headlights. I couldn't believe it. After a $10,000 fine, she was still at it. She stammered something about needing to collect proof of unsafe fencing, but I just held up my phone, already recording. "You know what's funny, Karen?" I said. "This is the 3rd time I've caught you trespassing. The county fine was just the appetizer. You're working your way toward the main course." She lunged forward like she might try to grab the phone, then thought better of it. She muttered a string of half-formed excuses, then bolted back toward her SUV parked down the road. By morning, I'd emailed the footage straight to Sheriff Tom, who called me back within the hour, laughing so hard he had to catch his breath. "She's cooked," he said. "Caught red-handed with tools in her hand. She's looking at aggravated trespassing now." The thing about Karen was, she believed she was untouchable. She thought rules were for everyone else, not for her. But that night by the fence, when the beam of my flashlight hit her face and she realized she was being recorded, I saw something new. Not just anger or arrogance, fear. And that told me one thing: the game was finally tilting. She wasn't just making a nuisance anymore. She was walking herself into a trap of her own making, and all I had to do was stand back and let gravity take its course. By the time word got around that Karen had been caught with wire cutters on my fence line, the neighborhood was buzzing. Out here, gossip travels faster than cell reception, and every trip into town felt like walking into a chorus of raised eyebrows and smothered grins. Folks would stop me in the feed store or nod my way at the diner with that look, half amusement, half disbelief, that said they'd heard the latest chapter in what was quickly becoming the county's most absurd feud. Sheriff Tom, meanwhile, had a field day with the evidence. He filed the aggravated trespassing charge, which came with heavier fines and the possibility of a short jail stint if she didn't shape up. He called me personally to let me know. I don't expect she'll see the inside of a cell, but this is the kind of charge that sticks to your name. HOA chairwoman with a rap sheet doesn't sound so fancy, does it? It should have been the knockout blow. Anyone else would have slunk away, licking their wounds, maybe mumbling an apology to save face. But not Karen. No, Karen operated on a different wavelength. The more she lost, the more convinced she became that she was being persecuted. By the time I saw her again, she was no longer just angry, she was rallying her forces. The first sign came when I noticed a new Facebook group pop up with the cheery title, "Save Our Community Aesthetics." At first glance, it looked harmless: photos of flower beds, driveway upgrades, garden gnomes. But tucked between the posts were long, ranting paragraphs clearly authored by Karen, describing how a certain farm owner was destroying the neighborhood's charm with unsightly structures and dangerous livestock practices. She never named me outright, but the photos she posted of my barn silhouetted against the sunset didn't exactly scream subtlety. Some neighbors joined in, liking her posts out of politeness, but most saw it for what it was: Karen's personal vendetta disguised as civic duty. I even had people screenshot her rants and send them to me with laughing emojis. I didn't respond publicly. I'd learned long ago that silence drove her crazier than confrontation. The less I gave her, the more she spiraled. But silence didn't stop her from escalating. One evening, I was tightening bolts on the tractor when I heard the unmistakable crunch of multiple car doors slamming shut. I looked up to see 4 vehicles parked along the edge of my property, their headlights still glowing. Out spilled Karen, a few of her loyal board members, and, this was the kicker, a local news crew. A real camera, boom mic, and all. I walked over, wiping my hands on a rag, and kept my face neutral. Karen was already in full performance mode, gesturing dramatically toward my barns and fences. "This is the blight on our neighborhood," she declared, pointing at my perfectly functional, freshly painted fence as though it were a toxic waste site. The news reporter, clearly not briefed on the comedy of it all, dutifully adjusted her mic and asked me for a statement. I paused long enough for the silence to stretch uncomfortably, then smiled. "Sure," I said. "Here's my statement. This is a working farm on private land outside HOA jurisdiction. The only blight here is the people trespassing to make up stories." The cameraman stifled a laugh as Karen's face flushed crimson. She tried to interrupt, but I held up a finger. "Also, if you'd like, I can show you the sheriff's report documenting her trespassing charges and fines. $10,000 isn't exactly a minor oversight." The reporter blinked, realizing there was a much juicier angle here than Karen's crusade about aesthetic. She turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, is that true? Have you been fined for trespassing?" Karen sputtered like a car with bad spark plugs, waving her arms and insisting it was politically motivated. The cameraman, to his credit, kept filming every second. I tipped my hat, told them to have a nice evening, and walked back to my tractor, leaving Karen fuming in the spotlight of her own making. 2 days later, the segment aired on the local news. To Karen's horror, it wasn't framed as a story about community blight. The anchor opened with, "A heated dispute between an HOA and a local farmer took a dramatic turn when allegations of trespassing led to a hefty fine." They even played the clip of me calmly explaining the situation while Karen flailed in the background. Overnight, her Facebook group became a laughingstock, flooded with sarcastic comments and memes of wire cutters. But humiliation only poured gasoline on her fire. If she couldn't beat me with fake notices or news spin, she'd find a new angle. And that angle, apparently, was zoning. One morning, I found a bright orange envelope stuffed into my mailbox. Not the usual utility bill or farm supply catalog, but an official-looking letter stamped with the county seal. Inside was a complaint notice claiming my barn violated setback requirement. For a second, my stomach dropped. A zoning violation could actually cause problems, unlike Karen's homemade notices. But when I looked closer, I saw the complaint had been filed anonymously, and the concern cited didn't even apply to my district. I called the county office, where the clerk chuckled and admitted they'd been receiving a flood of complaints all originating from the same email address. "We're flagging them as frivolous," she told me. "You've got nothing to worry about. But somebody's really got it out for you." I didn't even need to ask who. Karen was burning through every tool in her arsenal, and each one was backfiring. Yet part of me worried, not about the complaints themselves, but about how far she was willing to go. Someone that determined, that untethered from reality, wasn't going to stop at paperwork. She wanted a win, and when the system wouldn't hand it to her, she'd try to manufacture one. That theory proved right one rainy night when I heard a clatter outside near the equipment shed. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out into the downpour, and caught a glimpse of movement, someone darting behind the shed. My beam landed on a plastic gas can tipped on its side, glistening in the mud. My heart thudded. If Karen was desperate enough to tamper with my property in the middle of the night, I was past the point of playing defense. I called Tom immediately, and within 20 minutes, his cruiser rolled up, lights flashing against the rain. Together, we checked the shed. Nothing had caught fire, thankfully, but the smell of gas lingered. We found fresh footprints leading away from the shed toward the road, where tire marks curved wildly into the gravel. Tom looked grim. "She's gone from nuisance to dangerous," he said. "This isn't just trespassing anymore. This is intent." The next morning, I reviewed the footage from my trail cameras. There it was, clear as day. Karen's Lexus pulling up to the edge of my property, her figure darting across the frame with the gas can in hand. The rain blurred some details, but there was no mistaking her. I burned the footage onto a thumb drive and handed it to Tom. He shook his head slowly. "She's done. You can't explain away a gas can. But here's the thing, part of me almost pitied her. Almost. Watching that footage, I didn't see a powerful HOA tyrant. I saw a woman unraveling, clawing at every lever she thought gave her control, only to have each one snap off in her hand. She wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting the reality that she couldn't bend the world to her will. And the harder she pushed, the deeper she dug her own grave. What she didn't realize yet was that the county wasn't just going to fine her this time. No, this was about to tip into criminal charges. And if she thought a $10,000 fine was bad, she hadn't seen anything yet. The morning after the gas can incident, my farm felt different. Normally, chores carried their own rhythm, the steady scrape of a shovel, the clank of feed buckets, the low hum of cattle shifting in their pens. But that day, every sound felt sharper, every shadow heavier. My cows still munched their hay in calm indifference, but I couldn't shake the thought that just a few hours earlier, someone, Karen, had seriously tried to mess with my property. Fines were one thing, trespassing another, but fire? That was a line even I hadn't believed she'd cross. Sheriff Tom called before breakfast. His tone was clipped, official, the way he got when things moved out of small-town drama and into something with teeth. We've got the evidence log. I've already sent a copy to the county prosecutor. She's not walking away from this one. He paused. I'll be straight with you, though. Don't let your guard down. She's panicking, and panicked people do stupid things. I told him I wasn't planning to relax anytime soon. After I hung up, I made a decision. It wasn't enough to sit back and wait for the legal system to catch up to Karen. If she wanted to turn this into a siege, then I was going to fortify. By noon, I'd called a fencing contractor to reinforce the perimeter with new steel posts, ordered motion-activated floodlights for the barn, and lined up an extra set of trail cameras. I wasn't paranoid, I was prepared. And if Karen wanted to test that, well, she'd get the full experience. But Karen wasn't just licking her wounds. That afternoon, as I was stacking hay bales in the loft, my phone buzzed with a text from a neighbor. Turn on Channel 6. I dusted off my hands and flipped on the little TV in the kitchen. There she was, in full glory, sitting in a news studio with a perfectly arranged blouse and a martyr's expression. The harassment I've endured, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed, is beyond belief. I tried to protect our community, and now I'm being targeted by a farmer who refuses to respect standards. I've received threats, fines, and intimidation. She dabbed theatrically at the corner of her eye with a tissue. All I wanted was safety and harmony. I nearly choked on my coffee. The anchors nodded solemnly, clearly unaware of the mountain of evidence stacked against her. It was Karen's last weapon, playing victim for anyone gullible enough to listen. The interview didn't have the effect she hoped for, though. By evening, people in town were already tearing it apart on social media. Screenshots of the gas can footage started circulating with captions like, "Safety and harmony, huh?" and "Karen's fire safety tips, BYLGC, bring your own gas can." The more she tried to paint herself as a saint, the more the community laughed. For once, the tide wasn't just against her, it was drowning her. But Karen never fought fair. If public opinion didn't work, she'd aim lower. That night, as I finished dinner, I noticed headlights creeping along the road outside my property. Not unusual by itself, but the same car looped past 3 times in half an hour. The 4th time, it slowed near the gate. I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight and shined it down the gravel. The car accelerated, tires spitting stones, but not before I caught the license plate. One of Karen's board members. The next morning, I called Tom again. "She's got people watching my place now," I said. He sighed heavily. "We're building a case, trust me. But this isn't just petty harassment anymore. She's towing into stalking." The case moved faster than I expected. Within the week, the prosecutor filed formal charges: aggravated trespassing, attempted property damage, and harassment. Karen was served papers right on her pristine cul-de-sac driveway, in full view of her neighbors. According to one of mine who happened to drive by, she screamed at the deputies, then collapsed onto her manicured lawn, sobbing as though the ground itself had betrayed her. I should have felt satisfied, maybe even relieved. But there was still a gnawing in my gut. Because if I knew Karen, she wouldn't accept defeat in a courtroom. She'd look for a spectacle. And I was right. The court date arrived on a gray Thursday morning. I showed up in clean jeans and a button-down, straightforward and steady. Karen arrived 20 minutes late in a blizzard of perfume and pearl jewelry, clutching a binder thick with papers. She strutted into the courtroom like it was her stage. Her binder turned out to be filled with glossy photos of my barn, close-ups of cow manure, and screenshots of my tractor parked near the road. She waved them at the judge like they were damning evidence of my crimes. The prosecutor barely had to say a word. He just played the trail camera footage on the courtroom monitor. The image of Karen crouched by my fence with a gas can silence the room. You could almost hear the air whoosh out of her argument. The judge leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose like he'd seen enough HOA drama for one lifetime. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "Mrs. Miller, your actions are indefensible. You are fined $10,000 for repeated trespassing, plus restitution for attempted property damage, and you are hereby barred from entering the plaintiff's land under penalty of arrest. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Karen gasped, then began shouting over the judge, her voice shrill, accusing me, the prosecutor, even the sheriff's office of conspiring against her. Deputies escorted her out, her pearls jangling as she fought them every step. You'd think that would be the end, but the thing about Karen was that she didn't know how to quit. By the time I got back to the farm that evening, there was a voicemail waiting on my machine. Her voice was low, unhinged, dripping with venom. You might have the judge fooled, but you don't own me. You don't own this community. I'll make sure you regret every minute of this. I played it twice, then saved it for Tom. He listened, jaw tight, then nodded. That's intimidation. Another charge. And yet, despite everything, the farm kept turning. My cows didn't care about court rulings. The fences still needed mending, the fields still needed plowing. That was the thing about living out here. The world didn't stop because of one person's madness. But I carried Karen's voicemail in my mind like a ticking clock. She'd already pushed into dangerous territory once. The question wasn't if she'd try again. It was when. That answer came sooner than I liked. A week later, just as dawn was breaking, I found my front gate padlock cut clean through and tossed into the ditch. Deep tire ruts scarred the gravel drive, leading up to the barn. My stomach dropped. I sprinted to the barn doors and yanked them open. Inside, hay bales were scattered, feed bags slashed open, and one of my tractors had a fresh key snapped off in the ignition. Nothing burned this time, but it was destruction all the same. I stood there in the dusty light filtering through the rafters, fists clenched, jaw tight. Enough was enough. Karen had turned a petty feud into war. And now I was done playing defense. I picked up my phone and dialed Tom, already knowing what I'd say. She's crossed the line again. But this time, I'm not just pressing charges. I'm pressing everything. Because if Karen wanted to drag this fight out, then I'd make sure the next round ended it permanently. I decided the war needed a new front. Court orders and criminal charges were one thing, but Karen had a way of turning pressure into performative martyrdom that dragged other people into her orbit. She'd already convinced a few neighbors to sympathize, either out of genuine concern or because they liked the idea of someone policing what passed for taste on the county line. If I wanted to end this cleanly, I had to cut her off at the knees without becoming the monster she wanted me to be. So I hired a lawyer who didn't skimp on plain speaking or moral clarity, a woman named Ramirez who had a reputation for making entitled people wish they'd chosen a hobby instead of litigation. Ramirez moved fast and deliberately. She wasn't interested in dramatic headlines. She wanted airtight paper trails, witnesses who would testify, and a civil suit that would take the HOA's teeth away while cleaning up the damage Karen had done. The first thing she did was subpoena the HOA's meeting minutes and financial record. People like Karen love to hide behind committees and bylaws. If you pull the fabric hard enough, the threads show where someone's been mending things with their own money. Within a week, Ramirez had a binder that smelled faintly of copier toner and victory. The records told a story I'd suspected but hadn't known how to prove. Karen had been funneling HOA funds into maintenance projects that coincidentally made her property line look better and raised her curb appeal. There were invoices for landscape improvements that pointed to a contractor who, when called, remembered moving a few boulders and putting in a hedge at Karen's request under the table. There were donations that disappeared. There were minutes where Karen redefined community standards with an alarming amount of creative wording. It wasn't criminal, yet, but it was sneaky and the kind of chicanery that, once public, ruins a self-appointed civic savior. I didn't want to push my neighbors into a corner. Most of them were decent people who'd been lightly roped into Karen's theater. So Ramirez and I organized a small, private meeting. We invited the HOA board and a handful of neighbors who'd been on the fence, not out of malice but to give them the facts. I stood in my kitchen with a thermos of coffee and a mound of printouts, feeling the strangest little flutter of anticipation. This, I thought, was the long game. Show the community the receipts and let them make the moral calculus. When I walked into the community center, Karen was already there, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd been airbrushed into being proper. She offered me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I returned it with a calm nod. Ramirez began by laying out the timeline. The trespassing fines, the trail camera footage, the gas can incident, and then, smoothly, the HOA's financial irregularities. I watched the room shift as people processed the sequence. The casual trespasses became attempts to manipulate someone into silence. The anonymous complaint emails became part of a broader campaign to weaponize neighbors' good intentions. One man, an older fellow who ran the feed store and whose opinion carried weight, put his hand on his chin and asked Karen a direct question. "Why didn't you vote on these expenditures at a meeting?" Karen's face tightened. She stammered something about emergency beautification and protecting property values. The question had her anyway. She had no paper trail that justified her unilateral decisions. Members began to exchange looks, and the room filled with the soft, dangerous sound of people connecting dots. It was subtle, but the tide turned. People who'd been mildly amused by the drama suddenly felt duped. I felt sympathy for a moment, sympathy for neighbors who were unwittingly participating in someone else's vendetta, but that emotion was fleeting. The next feeling was clarity. The community didn't need a self-appointed aesthetic sheriff. It needed rules and transparency. Once the conversation moved to remedies, neighbors volunteered to audit the HOA books, and several long-standing members asked for an immediate recall vote. Karen's smile finally slid off her face like oil from a hot pan. She lashed out, of course. When cornered, she did what cornered people do. She lied louder. She accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign, of contacting the press, of bribing witnesses. Ramirez countered with evidence. Emails, bank statements, signed affidavits from the contractor whose signature had been used on bogus invoices. The room closed ranks around the facts like a fist. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board had no choice but to call for a special election to remove Karen as chairwoman and to appoint an independent accountant. In parallel, Ramirez filed a civil suit for damages and injunctive relief to permanently bar Karen and any HOA agents from approaching my property. The legal machinery moved like a well-oiled harvester. Motions, affidavits, discovery requests. Karen responded with theatrics. Press releases, a petition with signatures from people who probably didn't read the fine print, and another local news segment where she presented herself as a martyr for suburban aesthetic. It was tiresome. When the cameras rolled, I stayed off the record, letting the court file do the talking. The real blow came when the accountant completed his audit. The report showed misallocated funds and questionable contract. It didn't just embarrass Karen. It cast doubt over the board's governance. Members who'd passively endorsed her were suddenly apologizing in public forums, and several resigned to avoid further scrutiny. The HOA's own bylaws provided for immediate removal of officers for conduct unbecoming, a phrase that, in this case, had all the necessary teeth to take Karen down without a single melodramatic courtroom scene. The recall vote was ugly. Karen campaigned like a caged animal, sending flyers accusing me of bullying a community elder and holding late-night phone calls to those she thought still loyal. But the evidence was a heavy, convincing thing. When the community center doors opened on Election Day, I watched as neighbors, people I'd greeted at potlucks and lent tools to, walked in with ballots that looked for all the world like a quiet act of justice. The result was decisive. Karen was removed from her position. The handful of board members who'd enabled her followed suit or were voted out. It felt less like a triumph and more like the restoration of a small, fragile democracy. That should have been the end. A public reckoning, accountability, then a return to the steady rhythms of farm life. But Karen was not interested in quiet exit. She filed counterclaims, alleging defamation and a conspiracy to ruin her reputation. Those claims were as transparent as the paint on her perfectly manicured hedges, Ramirez shredded them in depositions with an ease that would have made a lesser opponent admit defeat. Depositions uncovered more oddities. Questionable check endorsements, a contractor who admitted to padding invoices, neighbors who confessed they'd signed petitions without reading them. The crossfire left Karen increasingly isolated. There was, however, one twist I hadn't anticipated. During discovery, a private email thread surfaced showing Karen attempting to broker a sale of several parcels adjacent to my property to a developer. The developer was interested in putting in a gated enclave, expensive houses, manicured lawns, right where my north pasture met a ridge with a view. The implication was ugly and simple. If my farm could be made unbearable enough, the land might be sold, consolidated, rezoned. It was the classic squeeze play: make the seller so desperate they accept a lowball offer. In other words, Karen hadn't been fighting for aesthetics. She'd been fighting for leverage. I felt a cold, precise anger when I read those emails. It explained motive in a way nothing else had. The trespassing, the complaints, the anonymous calls, sudden acts with a long-term strategy. It didn't justify anything she'd done, but it made the campaign personal and malicious. Ramirez added this to the civil suit as evidence of malicious intent and potential damages tied to attempted coercion. That piece of mail, metaphorically speaking, changed the stakes from neighborhood squabble to attempted property manipulation. In court, the combination of criminal charges, civil claims, and the HOA audit created a net that was hard to escape. By the time the county judge reviewed the evidence, Karen's options were limited. The criminal case advanced. The civil case presented a credible claim that she'd engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine my property for financial ends. The judge granted the injunction, awarded damages to cover repairs, and ordered the HOA to implement governance reforms, including external oversight for future expenditures. When the final papers were served, Karen's last gasp was a press release that read more like a resignation letter from reality. She accused me of ruining lives and tearing apart the community. I read it once, then folded it and filed it next to the other documents that had locked her out of my land permanently. Part of me felt a surprising pang of sorrow. She'd been human once. Flawed, yes, but human, until pride and paranoia turned her into something dangerous. After the legal dust settled, the farm settled back into its rhythms. I fixed the damaged shed, replaced the padlock, and spent a long morning repairing fence posts that had taken a beating during the chaos. Neighbors returned to ordinary courtesies. The feed store owner clapped me on the shoulder when I walked in to buy seed. The sheriff checked in less often, his visits reverting from urgent to friendly. Ramirez closed the file with a short, efficient email. Case closed, injunction in place, HOA reforms mandated, damages awarded. I didn't celebrate in the way people imagine when standing up to a bully. There was no parade, no triumphant speech. I did, however, buy a new chain for the gate and a proper lock, both of which felt emblematic of a small, hard-won security. And when I walked the perimeter that evening with the sunset spilling like honey across the fields, I let the quiet wash over me. The cows grazed, the barn cast a long shadow, and for the first time in months, the farm felt like something I'd defended successfully without becoming someone I didn't recognize. It wasn't about destroying Karen. It was about stopping her before she could ruin other people's lives in pursuit of her own thin sense of control. That, in the end, was the point of the long game. Not to be vengeful, but to be strategic, precise, and, when necessary, mercilessly thorough. The land was safe for now. The rest, that was up to the law, the neighbors, and the slow, steady work of growing things that mattered. By the time the lock on my gate had been replaced and the mess in the barn cleaned up, I thought I'd reached the peak of Karen's insanity. Court fines, injunctions, audits. It was a mountain of pressure even the most stubborn ego shouldn't survive. But Karen wasn't like other people. She lived in a world where losing wasn't an option, so she rewrote reality until it fit her version of events. And when reality didn't bend, she doubled down harder. The first sign came a week after the recall vote stripped her of her HOA throne. I was stacking hay when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a sharp, nasal voice announced itself as Attorney Peterson, representing Mrs. Miller. I almost laughed. Karen had hired her own lawyer, one who sounded fresh out of law school and overeager to prove himself. He launched into a speech about how I was harassing his client, how my trail cameras were an invasion of privacy, and how Karen planned to countersue for defamation. I let him finish his monologue, then asked calmly, "Did she show you the footage of her with a gas can on my property?" Silence crackled through the line. Then he muttered something about pending review and hung up. I pictured Karen pacing her kitchen, coaching him on what to say, and I shook my head. This wasn't defense, it was flailing. But flailing is dangerous when mixed with obsession. A few days later, my neighbor Sarah called to warn me that Karen had started holding backyard meetings with a handful of loyalists. "She's calling it a community action committee," Sarah said, her voice low, conspiratorial. "It's just the same 3 people who always back her, but she's telling them the farm is a hazard zone, and you're the reason the neighborhood's declining." I wasn't surprised. Karen never conceded, she just rebranded her battles. But what did surprise me was what Sarah said next. "She's trying to organize a protest. At your farm. With signs and everything." The idea was absurd enough to make me laugh, but sure enough, that Saturday morning I heard honking outside my gate. When I walked up the drive, I saw 5 people standing on the shoulder of the road, holding poster boards. One read, "Stop the stench." Another, in glittery letters, declared, "Save our community." Karen was front and center, megaphone in hand, chanting slogans as though the gravel road outside my barn was the National Mall. I leaned on the gate and watched. They were technically on public road, so I couldn't kick them out, but I also wasn't about to indulge them. When Karen spotted me, she raised the megaphone. "This farm is a blight. Hazardous. Illegal." Her voice cracked at the end, partly from passion, partly from frustration that I wasn't rising to the bait. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. Not angrily. Calmly. Just documenting. Her face twisted, and she turned back to her small band of followers, chanting louder. But the thing about a protest with 5 people is that it looks less like a movement and more like a midlife crisis. Passing cars slowed, honked, not in support but in confusion. A couple of teenagers from down the road stopped to laugh and snap photos. By noon, her little rally dissolved. The followers slinked back to their SUVs, leaving Karen alone with her megaphone. She screamed one last slogan into the empty air before storming off. The footage went viral locally. Someone posted it to Facebook with the caption, "Karen saves the world, one cow at a time," and the comments lit up. My favorite read, "Imagine having this much free time." Another, "Is she protesting or auditioning for a reality show?" The ridicule hit harder than any fine could. For someone obsessed with appearances, public mockery was poison. But humiliation didn't slow her, it sped her up. The next escalation came quietly, almost too quietly. One evening I noticed my water pressure was lower than usual. At first, I thought it was a pump issue. But when I checked the line that ran from the well, I found the shutoff valve near the road had been tampered with. The padlock was cut, the handle twisted halfway closed. My jaw tightened. This wasn't theater anymore, it was sabotage. I called Tom immediately. He came out, took photos, and shook his head. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore," he said. "This is criminal mischief, plain and simple. And combined with the other charges, she's digging herself into a hole she won't climb out of." We filed another report, and Ramirez added it to the civil case. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Each time Karen lost, she escalated. And each escalation got closer to crossing a line that couldn't be walked back. The line came 2 nights later. I woke around midnight to the sound of barking, my dog, Buddy, losing his mind near the front porch. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the yard. At first, I saw nothing. Then the beam landed on a figure crouched near my mailbox. My pulse spiked. It was Karen. She froze, eyes wide, a can of spray paint in her hand. On the side of my mailbox, in dripping red letters, she'd managed to scrawl "nuisance" before I caught her. "Really?" I said, my voice carrying through the quiet night. "Vandalism? That's your play now." She sputtered something about free speech, but her voice shook. She wasn't the bold crusader anymore, she was a cornered animal. I lifted my phone again, recording. She lunged forward like she wanted to knock it away, then thought better of it. For a split second, her mask cracked and I saw fear. Not anger. Fear. The sheriff arrived 10 minutes later, lights washing the gravel in red and blue. Karen was arrested on the spot for vandalism and violation of the court injunction. As they put her in the cruiser, she screamed about conspiracies, about how she'd expose the corruption, about how none of us understood what was at stake. The words sounded desperate, hollow, almost unhinged. Watching the taillights disappear, I realized something I hadn't let myself believe until then. The war was ending. Not because she chose to stop, but because she no longer had the power to continue. The law, the community, even her allies, they were gone. She was fighting shadows now. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, like dragging a plow through a field that never ended, only to find the soil barren when you finished. I went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the half-finished mug of coffee I'd poured earlier. For months, my life had revolved around Karen's chaos. And now, with her finally cornered, I felt a hollow quiet settle in. Still, the long game wasn't over. The prosecutor had her dead to rights, and the civil suit had teeth. But more than that, the community had seen her for what she was. Whatever came next, she wasn't coming back from it. And maybe that was enough. The farm was mine again. Quiet, steady, ordinary. But deep down, I knew there was one more chapter to play out, because people like Karen never go down without one last, spectacular crash. The morning after Karen's arrest, the farm felt different again, but this time, the air wasn't heavy. It was lighter, almost fragile, like the silence after a storm when you're not sure if the clouds are finally clearing or just waiting to roll back in. I went about my chores with a kind of wary calm. The cows still needed feeding, fences still needed checking, and the tractor still coughed to life like it always did, but under it all was the knowledge that the war was nearly over. Not because Karen had surrendered, she never would, but because the law had finally caught up with her. Sheriff Tom stopped by mid-morning, his cruiser crunching down the gravel drive. He leaned against the hood with his coffee, the way he always did when he came with updates that were serious but not urgent. "She spent the night in holding," he said, glancing at the barn where Buddy dozed in the shade. "Judge set bail, but the conditions are strict. No contact, no proximity to your property, and no HOA business. She posts bail, she's on a short leash. If she slips once, she's done." I nodded, absorbing it without celebration. Tom squinted at me. "You don't look relieved." I shrugged. "She's Karen. A leash just means she'll find a new way to pull." Tom chuckled, but it was humor edged with truth. He left me with the assurance that the prosecutor was building the case tight, and that, for once, the system wasn't going to let her slide. Still, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder as I walked the fence line later that day, half expecting her Lexus to roll up with some new scheme. It didn't. The fields were quiet, the sky a wide autumn blue, and I started to believe maybe, just maybe, the fight was settling into its final act. 2 days later, I got a letter. Not from Karen, not from the HOA, but from the county courthouse. The civil suit was moving forward. Ramirez called to walk me through the details. Damages for the vandalism, restitution for the broken padlocks and slashed feed bags, compensation for the nights I'd spent cleaning up after her tantrums instead of working the farm. More importantly, the injunction would be made permanent. She would be legally barred from stepping foot on my land again. Ramirez's voice carried the dry satisfaction of someone who had dismantled many self-styled tyrants. "She's finished," she said. "Not just in your life, publicly. These things stick." And stick they did. News spread faster than hay dust in a dry barn. The same local outlet that once aired her martyr act now ran a headline with her mugshot. "Former HOA chairwoman faces criminal charges after farm feud." It wasn't sensational, it was factual, damning, and final. Social media piled on. The same neighbors who once humored her now shook their heads in disbelief at what she'd become. Memes circulated of her protest signs, her face mid-yell, the spray-painted nuisance she left on my mailbox. What she had tried to make a crusade had become a cautionary tale. But Karen wasn't gone yet. On the morning of her hearing, she showed up at the courthouse wearing a pale suit, her hair pulled back tight, her face set in an expression that tried to be calm but landed closer to brittle. She carried that same binder she'd lugged into every meeting, thick with papers that meant nothing to anyone but her. When the judge read out the list of charges, trespassing, vandalism, harassment, attempted property damage, her jaw clenched so hard I thought she'd crack a tooth. Ramirez spoke for me, steady and surgical. She laid out the evidence, the timeline, the trail camera footage, the voicemail, the audit findings. Each piece stacked like fence rails, building a structure too solid for Karen to topple. When Karen's turn came, she launched into a tirade about conspiracies, corruption, and victimhood. She pointed at me, at Ramirez, even at the judge, her voice rising higher and higher until the bailiff stepped closer. It wasn't a defense, it was a meltdown. The judge waited for her to burn herself out before delivering the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Fines totaling more than she'd ever managed to wring from her HOA budget, restitution to me, mandatory community service, and, most damning of all, a suspended jail sentence that would become real if she violated the injunction again. The gavel came down with the finality of a door slamming shut. She crumpled then. Not physically, but in her eyes. For the first time since this war began, she looked small. Not enraged, not imperious, just small. She shuffled out of the courtroom without a word, her binder clutched against her chest like a shield that had finally failed. I should have felt triumphant. I should have savored the moment. Instead, I just felt tired. Months of battle, of chaos bleeding into every part of my life, had ended not with fireworks but with paperwork. That was justice. Not cinematic, not flashy, just steady and inevitable. When I got back to the farm that evening, the sun was setting low over the fields. The cows wandered lazily, tails flicking at flies. Buddy sprawled on the porch, tail thumping when he saw me. I stood at the gate and looked out at the land Karen had tried so hard to make unlivable, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it was just mine again. Quiet. Oh. Over the next few weeks, life eased back into rhythm. I repaired what she'd broken, painted over the spray paint on the mailbox, installed new locks where old ones had been cut. Neighbors stopped by, not to gossip, but to offer a hand or share a laugh about how the whole fiasco had finally ended. The HOA, stripped of Karen's reign, voted in a new chairperson, a practical woman who cared more about potholes than aesthetics. The community settled, the way soil does after a hard rain. And Karen? She faded. Not all at once, but gradually. Her Facebook group withered. Her allies distanced themselves. Her Lexus sat parked in her driveway more often, gathering dust where it used to patrol. She was still there, of course. People like her don't vanish. But she was no longer the storm. She was just another neighbor, defanged by her own undoing, her power gone. One crisp evening, as I walked the fence line, I saw her standing in her yard across the way. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no shouting, no clipboard, no megaphone. Just a woman staring at the land she'd tried to control and couldn't. She turned away first. That was the last time she mattered. I went back to my farmhouse, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The fields stretched out before me, golden and endless, the cows grazing in the distance, the fences solid and unbroken. For the first time in months, the quiet wasn't tense, it was peaceful. The war was over. Not with a bang, not with a final showdown, but with the slow, grinding weight of truth and patience. Karen had lost, not just the fines, the lawsuits, the chairmanship, but the one thing she valued most: control. And me? I'd won by doing what I always did. By standing firm, by letting her bury herself deeper with every move, by playing the long game. Because in the end, that's what people like Karen never understand. You don't beat them by shouting louder or fighting dirtier. You beat them by outlasting them, by letting their own entitlement become the noose they hang themselves with. And as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, I leaned back in my chair and let the peace of my farm settle around me. The fences stood. The land was safe. And for the first time in a long time, I could finally breathe easy.